Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nasher Sculpture Center's 360 Speaker Series. I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today it is my honor to welcome artist Joel Shapiro. Like many of you, perhaps, I thought I knew what to expect when our curatorial staff announced that we would be hosting a Joel Shapiro exhibition. Shapiro's works in the Nasher collection are old friends that enliven our galleries with their exceptional treatment of balance and weight. What I wasn't prepared for, however, was an installation that would swallow me whole, a gravity-defying array of colorful forms that managed to be both attractive and compellingly psychological. If you haven't yet been to the Nasher to see this installation, I suggest that you treat yourself to some quality time in the space, and also take the time to soak in Shapiro's rich and inky drawings, which open up new ways of seeing his sculptural work. Shapiro himself is rightly considered one of the most influential sculptors of our time, and we could likely host a second lecture describing his many accomplishments. Some highlights of his illustrious career include over 160 solo shows and retrospectives, in addition to works held in the collections of over 100 public institutions worldwide. He has been included multiple times in such prestigious group exhibitions as the Whitney Biennial, Documenta, and the Venice Biennale. More than 30 commissions and publicly cited sculptures by the artist are located in major Asian, European, and North American cities. Shapiro was elected to the Swedish Royal Academy of Art in 1994 and to the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 1998. In 2005, he received the Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters, France. Our chief curator, Jed Morse, will join Shapiro in conversation today. Since 1999, Morse has held curatorial positions at the Dallas Museum of Art and at the Nasher Sculpture Center, where he has recently organized exhibitions focused on the work of Anne Veronica Janssens, Alex Israel, Giuseppe Pannone, and Phillida Barlow. I look forward to an enjoyable conversation this morning, so please join me in welcoming Joel Shapiro and Jed Morse.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. We are, of course, thrilled to have Joel here, I think Anna stole my thunder a little bit with that introduction because it is such a surprising thing. I've tried to start off our conversation with something that looks very familiar to most of you who have been to the Nasher Sculpture Center. This is an untitled work from 1985 to 87, bronze that Joel did, that's currently in the Nasher Collection Gallery at the Sculpture Center. And it's something that I think is what we've come to expect out of his work. It is a rather simple arrangement of rectangular forms that nonetheless shows the kind of exuberance that kind of pared down and simplified arrangement can have, and the suggestiveness that it has. Since Joel did not choose to title his works for many years, they've all taken on various nicknames, and this one has taken on the nickname among our staff at the Nasher Sculpture Center as the Breakdancer.
The Breakdancer.
But Joel, if this is what I think most people in the audience know of your work, how does one go from that to this, which is the current installation that Joel has made for this exhibition at the Nasher Sculpture Center? It's 5 independent objects that were selected and then expanded upon for this particular space. So the space had at least something to do with their selection and with the elaboration that they went through after that. But how does one go from that kind of dynamic, suggestive figure to this much more open and spatial installation?
Well, can you hear me? Through hard work. Well, I mean, I know I don't mean to sound, but when you look at an artist's work, you have to look at the body of work. And just like everything else, it grows and Is it easier to hold this?
I think so. Might be.
How do you do that? Basically, I mean, if sculpture is about a language of form, and a language and form in space, you know, the space we live in, the space we occupy, architectural space, and I think what I've been trying to do is to try and, you know, externalize my thoughts, you know, as form. I don't know why I can't talk. I must be anxious. Words are, or I had too much to drink. 2 openings in a row, very challenging. And I think if we really, I think we will eventually. I didn't put these slides together, these images. If we look at early work of mine, it was really about insisting, doing something small that was quite insistent, that differentiated the space and quality that you experienced without being large and massive.
You had mentioned in a kind of impromptu tour with a group of people yesterday that the breakdancer figure, that we like to call him, is playing with the notion of inverted forms.
Well, formally, yeah, there's one, there are 2 mirror images and one is inverted. So it was sort of putting 2 things together to do something that was simultaneously going up and going down at the same time, you know, to generate action and activity so the form would be animate. I mean, but that's a very formal take on it. Also, I think I recognized early on that I don't think, you know, that I don't think sculptors invent form. I think they may invent a radical use of form, and maybe by organization of different forms come up with a radical resolution. But, you know, you're not going to invent a shape. I mean, no, it's sort of, there's nothing new under the sun. But I do think the organization of form in space can be radical, new, and generate a particular experience.
There's some, you know, sorry. So the installation that's at the Nasher right now, I mean, there are almost 20 years between the breakdancer figure and the installation at the Nasher. And a lot has developed in your work since then. I've kind of organized slides to kind of take steps back through time. One of the other works that we're so thrilled to show at the Sculpture Center within the context of this exhibition is the fantastic sculpture 20 Elements from that most of you know at North Park, from North Park Shopping Center, which is now in the entrance bay at the Nasher.
Oh, it's up there?
Yeah, so it's
okay.
That's
a work. Actually, if you look at the first work, we don't have to go back to it again. You know, when you attach one form to another form, using the plane or one, you know, if I attach this to that, right, and then I attach that to that, you know, all connected, flush. There's a certain limit of expressive possibility. Also, and I think that's something I fully investigated in my work. And in that early work, I wanted to make a more immediate work, more exuberant and less dependent. This is difficult. I mean, less dependent on a plane as a place, less dependent on, say, the floor and the wall as a means of organization. So I would take chunks of painted wood, you know, not capriciously, because there was always a selection, put them together as fast as possible with a pin gun, shooting nails into the wood until I came up with a form that I thought was satisfactory and really communicated what I was feeling at the time. And so this piece was a whole series, and a lot of it, had to do with 9/11. I know this sounds corny, but I was sort of taking pieces. There's a piece in the second room, a wood piece. Do we have a photograph of that? The wood piece, the blue piece?
Yeah, we do.
Well,
we'll
you'll see it
we'll
later.
get to it
I'll
in a
point
moment.
it out.
Yeah.
You know, where I take a form, put it in the air, and hold it in the air with 3 sticks. So I've been trying to break away from how the floor dominates the organization of form. The equivalent in painting and drawing would be how the frame or how the plane or the picture plane or the sheet organizes your thought. So in a way, I would like to overwhelm that or make the attempt to overwhelm that, because I think the possibility of expression is much greater. Is this too complicated? I'm sure it is. Anyway, so, okay, and I was playing around with the collapse of form and forms falling and lifting, and I think after 9/11, and looking at the tragic photographs and the tragic results, that, the reality of collapse and then playing with collapse are 2 different things. So you saw all these forms cascading down. I mean, this is sort of, and it really seemed to make my work seem far less significant. Really, well, I never thought it was the most significant thing in the world, but, versus the real world, it's a kind of note. And I thought somehow that pushed my work to another level where I felt the work had to have more meaning and less illusion of fall and maybe more actual falling and coming together. So I began doing stuff really fast, capriciously, with pin guns and lots of wire, where I would take forms, and spin them around. What I was intent on is not organizing the work on a plane. I didn't want the tabletop or flatness to organize something. And flatness is sort of a construct. Okay, next step in the evolution of this piece. So I had a lot of models. And then the Musée d'Orsay, which is the great 19th century railroad station in Paris, where they showed 19th century work, the director asked me, he was organizing a bunch of shows called correspondences, where he would invite contemporary artists to do a work or exhibit work in relation to anything they wanted in the collection. So it was very empowering. You walk around in the museum, and there's a guy behind you with a camera. He says, "You can have whatever you want, So I said, okay, well, the Carpeaux, the dance, is that up there now?
There it is.
Okay, is one of the great emblems of 19th century French culture. In its day, it was radical. It's a neoclassical work, but beyond the veneer of that style, the kind of configuration really corresponded with this model that I had in my studio, with this maquette that was in the studio. And I said, well, I'd like to do that, and I'd also like to bring a Degas wax down to the ground floor. Good luck. So, he said, no, the Degas do not move. And, so I was Degas would have been the easy one, to show with a piece like what you refer to.
The Breakdancer.
As BD. I'm not going to say Breakdancer. So I settled on the Carpeaux. And I think that, I think I had looked at the Carpeaux very carefully. they have Carpo and then the gates of hell above Carpo on the second floor. And those are these two, well, they're not colossal, but they're very grand sculptures. And Carpo was held in total disrepute. I mean, if you talk to a serious modernist, they think that was the end of art. I mean, that was the end of old-fashioned art. New art begins with Rodin, it ended with Carpo. But everyone knows that Rodin was influenced by Carpo, particularly Carpo's models in Bozzetti, which were very free and fluid. He tended to have a massive amount of, he was very popular. Anyway, it's a really interesting sculpture. I'm not going to get into details of the sculpture that I discovered, which I mentioned to Linda Nochlin, and she said, only you would find that. But I won't tell you. It had something to do with the Courbet painting. But I think there are all these guy artists having sort of fun, and I think Carpo and Courbet must have had some overlap. Anyway, so I showed that there. And this is the second time it's been shown at a museum. And Nancy and David bought the piece, which I was ecstatic, because it was kind of everyone, I mean, people in France wanted it, but, it never materialized. Nothing ever happened. So it's great that it's found a home. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think that's
the question.
Right. This notion of trying to get away from the power that the ground has over sculpture, and with expanded compositions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole,
something you've been doing for a long time.
Yeah, there's a whole history of, certain sculptors work more freely in space, and other sculptors kind of justify everything by linking stuff together, and it's a sort of, so you could see it, you could see like Degas and Calder as artists who really project thought into the world and the way they organize form. And Rodin's somebody who builds form up from the ground. And I think to a large extent David Smith does, although not in the more delicate work. It has to do with, attitude and your sense of self and place and how you think. So I've been trying to break up form. And as I said, there's no I don't think anyone ever invented form, that there was a new form that never existed. You could say there was modeling in Giacometti that was different, and I think if you took, but I think it's the organization of form that's really important and radical in what differentiates work and how people deal with material. What are we on now?
So let me just run through a few of these and get a sense of the chronology. So this piece that you see now is from the aughts, 2000 to 2007.
Oh, 2007, yeah. And again, this piece, I originally put this together using, wood, wire, and pin guns. And there were different chunks from different periods of time that I put all together.
And then the piece that we have in the garden at the Sculpture Center is also kind of...
Yeah, this is an earlier piece.
Yeah, from the 90s, 97.
And probably the kind of most serious, or sort of largest for sure, and I'm sure the best kind of configuration of that time. And you could see that, even in this, I mean, this is a piece I'm sure I made it one way and then inverted the piece. Or the piece was lateral and then I inverted it. I mean, to try and subvert the form from being so kind of totemic and built up from the ground, building up from the ground. Next.
And then we get into some of these suspended pieces, and these are a nice example of that process that you have of starting off with small pieces of wood and a pin gun and wire.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not the sort of sculptor who sits there with a chisel, chiseling out a likeness. I mean, I'm just not interested in that. And what I am interested in is how form is organized and what that form means in terms of, it's what it means as an individual psychologically. And, I don't like to say in the world, because I don't want to be grandiose. Let's go next.
And then, here is Verge.
Oh, Verge.
Yeah.
Nice name, Verge. The reason I called it Verge is because this is a work that verged on public and private space. It's on Savile Row, and it was a private commission that had to be sanctioned by the city of Westminster. And I actually wanted to project, what I really proposed in this was a lot of falling form, but as I worked more and more with the architect, it became more and more recognizable and unified. But it does sort of intrude into the public realm, and it's suspended. I also thought, it dawned on me the reason they will, I shouldn't be such a wise guy, but I think the retail space on Savile Row is incredibly expensive. And this piece didn't occupy any of it. So that's why.
It didn't take up valuable real estate.
But anyway, it's very successful. It really works. And you see it from the Academy coming down the street.
Yeah.
And now it's it's over Hauser and Wirth Art Gallery. Yeah. I can't imagine that they're particularly happy with it. But that's not my issue. The next photograph is a show. This was an exhibition at the Haus der Kunst.
In the 90s.
In the
97,
yeah. It was an interesting exhibition.
So I included this one because of the figure.
Oh, the figure on the
walking
wall.
up the wall.
But I did that because this is such a tainted space. I mean, this is a building that was built by Troost, Troost, who was a ship's architect and happened to be Hitler's favorite architect, soon to be replaced by whatever his name is, the next one. Anyways, and this was Hitler's favorite building. And after World War II, the city of Cologne turned it into a museum. One side, they have active contemporary art, the other side is a kind of, I don't know if it's the museum of, it's something, I don't know if it's state or it's Munich or whatever it is. And, it's kind of a complicated space. So it was a space that was basically designed for, large Nazi sculpture, propagandistic sculpture, and parades and marches. So I sort of took the piece and shoved it high up on the wall as a sort of, as some radical gesture in opposition to the use of the space beforehand. But I don't know if anyone read that, and it was really difficult to talk about. Nobody was particularly interested. Or they were interested, but they don't want to hear about it. Anyway, so that's how that show evolved. It was a very good show with painted wood.
There was, it's interesting because the figure on the wall, I don't think it's, you've done relief sculptures before, but that's the first, was that the first time you placed a figure kind of high up on the wall? It seems to be, the predecessor.
That was high up, yeah.
An important predecessor to Verge, that kind of suspended figure.
No, this is, but this had a lot to do with my talk about trying to organize stuff that wasn't involved with the floor and the wall. So, of course, I went from one flat to another flat, but still. Now, if I did this now, I would do an entirely different exhibition.
What would you do differently?
Well, I would suspend stuff, or else do some gigantic, colossal figure, just like a Tauric. Tauric? Yeah. Nobody else does. This is not artwork we like to talk about.
So this and then...
And actually, the Haus der Kunst was where they had the Degenerate Art Show, which was the important, the show where they gathered up all the kind of modern German painting and, you know, to show people what they should not like.
So this one, and then of course the next one, which is work in the Nasher collection that we have on you. But
So
these kind of, you know,
early,
lifted
this is
figures,
sort of
lifted
trying
forms.
to animate form, you know, by getting it off the floor and getting it into the air in some capricious or more free-flowing way. And also it kind of has figuration. So you have to look at the strings in the work, even in this show, as some mechanism, not unlike a leg or an arm, that allows the work to be in a particular place.
I mean, it's kind of hard to circumvent or undermine the mind's desire to see figures. Do you find that difficult to do?
Oh, you were asking me, I was thinking.
Yeah, no, it's all right.
I thought you were commenting on what I said. Just repeat the question.
So I was just saying, you know, it's sometimes really difficult for the mind, you know, to circumvent the mind's desire to see a figure. You know, if you stick, you know, five kind of rectangular prisms together, then you've
I don't get the question.
I mean, do you try and subvert the figure in your work?
Do I try to subvert the figure?
Not really.
Not particularly. I mean, I'm sort of.
If it's there,
I'm
it's
interested
there.
in any reference in the work. I
Yeah.
like the work loaded with layer and reference. I mean, I'm not somebody, you know, I'm not a minimalist.
Yeah.
And I also think that, you know, that the sculpture inevitably is a reflection of the individual who makes it. And a kind of, even if it's a flat plane on the floor, you know, if it's a Carl Andre, the most reductive piece possible, you know, of 6 plates of steel, you know, that is a kind of surrogate of the artist. So, you know, I believe that, I mean, there's real truth in form. What you choose to do is, to some extent, what you are.
The
So there's
minimalist
truth in form. Whether you're a minimalist or a whatever, you know, whatever you might do, doesn't matter. It's just, it really is an indication of who you are, and you can read the work in terms of, you know, as some, well, it's not really a surrogate, but some manifestation of character, of a total person.
This one is really interesting. I was not familiar with this work, the one
This
you're
guy,
looking
God,
at
I
right
hope it's
now.
still around. It was so made out of such junk.
But, you know,
It's interesting.
It is interesting. You've got these kind of independent forms that are loosely connected with those dowels.
Yeah, I did a
Long.
couple of pieces where I was using dowels or steel rods to try and separate different parts and get them. And that all led to the wire stuff. You don't have the piece that's at Yale, huh?
The wire stuff.
Well, there's one with. Well,
Which is
it's too interesting. I'll send you pictures.
Okay, great.
This is
And then, what would be the kind of immediate predecessor, the kind of work that you've been doing more recently, are these spatial installations of planks or rectangular forms suspended in space.
Yeah, I was actually, you know, I mean, a lot of the work there are a number of pieces that aren't in here where I was placing something in space, you know. I'd have an assistant hold it up and then I'd sort of tack the thing up with 1x2s just to hold it in position, and then do the next piece, and then do the next piece. So I think, you know, then I was doing wire and string, and then at some point I just thought, well, I can just suspend forms in space. And I did a show at Pace Gallery. We don't have any pictures of that?
I just included one of them.
Of that?
I've done a lot of work. I couldn't include everything.
Yeah. Okay, so so we have the one. This was
This
the
is the
subsequent
museum
show
Ludwig.
where I was offered. It's the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, and a young curator saw the show and said, saw the show in New York and sort of said, well, we have to do this. And that was a tough space. It was 40-foot ceilings with a colossal stairway going down, which an artist had built, so it was hard to remove without objecting, without offending people. I built a model of the space, and I built these pieces in my studio and began suspending them. It was a lot of narrative in this piece, sort of sub-narrative. It was not, each unit had its own little story and meaning.
That they're amazing things, because you can't, the photographs just don't do them justice. They're so spatially complex.
Yeah, they're spatially complex, and they reorganize themselves as you go around. So the work's, well, it's always dynamic in relationship to to the perceiver.
It reminds me of it reminded me of what one might experience were they able to inhabit a Malevich suprematist painting.
Really? Right behind that black square.
With the rectangular forms in space and the
Well, I think they
shifts in the
effectively,
rectangular
they
forms
really, well, in the installation here, I came out, of course, I know the space, and if you're offered to do the possibility of doing something in a really meaningful, considered, deeply intelligent space.
You're talking about the Nasher installation.
I mean, you can't just stick in some objects you made, over the last 10 years. I mean, you could, and be a bore, at least in my eye. So I sort of took the opportunity. I was originally going to do those sticks in there. I just felt that I wanted more. I wanted more reference in the work, and I wanted volume within the work. And I was tired of just reading, one color against another color. So I had forms in the studio, and I joined some together and kind of adjusted them. I didn't have to do a lot of adjustment. I mean, I made them, I think I had to change one or two, but basically chose them and tried to develop this narrative, this sort of dream sequence. I also had a figure on the ground. It would look, you wouldn't read it as a figure, but it had a torso reference. And then there was this house instead of a head. And that was sort of it was almost a synopsis of the exhibition. And and if I wanted the same scale as these things, it became really dopey and it made no sense. And also I think, you don't, it would sort of demean the experience of the room. So I pulled that out. It was much more successful. When I didn't do the piece, also it was monumental. It was really dumb. I mean, it was sort of like, it was a piece about explaining the work away. And I just wanted this to be a deep, resonant exhibition, which, I think it is. The only downside is you have to watch where you walk. You can't. So, I mean, the idea of freezing a piece in space, they're not frozen, they move a little bit. I mean, you have to use, again, you have to use the floor and the wall, and I have to rely on geometry. I have to rely on the architecture, but the architecture is not organizing the piece. So I'm interested in this projection of thought into the world. And the green Caro, and then the selection in the other room is really interesting because some of those artists do that and some don't. And it's just so nice to be able to exhibit work within the context of 20th and 21st century sculpture. It's much more, I think, much more meaningful than having a show, I mean, it's not more meaningful, but it's a very small, it's extremely, I think you can learn a lot. As an artist, you learn a lot.
the green piece in that photograph.
It's hard for me to hear you. The sound back here is not good.
So the green piece.
My hearing stinks. What?
So the green piece at the back of
Right.
of the gallery was made as a negative or an open form in correspondence with the massive orange form that's kind of
Right, well,
suspended
yeah,
just
I mean,
above the
I
ground.
think there's a kind of, to show the front of the gallery, or not the street side, the blue and the red piece really kind of work with each other. And then there's this sort of isolated yellow form in the center. And then the back two pieces, one is green and one is orange, really big. That's a big form, and they're very lightweight. I actually had that form open, and I had it in an entirely different position. And then I kept rearranging the form. As you build the form, you have another sense of its meaning, so you would adapt and adjust the point of view. It's pretty free. I mean, the problem being an artist is remaining free. It's not sort of narrowing down your work so you're doing the same, boring thing over and over again. I think the idea is to, at least within your capacity, to sort of explore the full range of possibility. There are probably another 20 ways this could be configured.
So
On the other hand, it would not have been configured. The configuration is dependent upon the space.
The next photo is of the red piece, and I chose that because it's the photo that gives the clearest sense of this this kind of form that's reminiscent of a house. I mean, that's something that's been a part of your work since the early 70s. And I wanted to show a few things, and then we can talk about that form. If we can get it to move here. There we go. So there's Deux Maisons in Orléans, France.
Deux Maisons, right.
Yeah. And then there's the...
Are you showing that now?
I just clicked through it.
Well, that has a little backstory.
Oh, well, let's go back. What's the backstory to this one?
The backstory was the same. The director of Serge Lemoine, who's a modernist and a very important history professor in Paris, there was a new tramway, and they asked artists to do follies. And architects and artists to do follies at each tram stop. And he particularly liked my work. I mean, it's not a bad, but this is in Orléans, Jeanne d'Arc. So, and well, the backstory is by the time the piece was up, I think so all this whole folly went. It's great. You go into, but this was the entry into the town. I thought it was, I was slightly uncomfortable. It was slightly too much of a radical statement, but anyway. And then the politics changed. Something happened. I forget. He was under a more liberal administration, then a conservative administration came in. And in France, and I think the new mayor was not so sympathetic. But anyway, it's there, and I think it actually has gained in popularity. So that's a turnaround as you drive into town. I'm not telling a story. I'm sorry. Okay. The next one is Loss and Regeneration.
Yeah, the U.S. Holocaust Museum and Memorial.
Right, that was a competition. And I actually originally wanted the house on the building. And I was told by the architect, quite bluntly, that won't get through federal fine arts. I can guarantee that. So that's so much about that. That was a complicated piece. And this was very controversial. I mean, certain people, as Walter Benjamin said, there is no poetry after the Holocaust. I don't think, which meant that you can't make art. It's been interpreted as that you can't art can't exist after such a sort of catastrophe. But I think there were a number of artists involved in this project. Richard Serra had a work inside. Ellsworth Kelly had a work inside. Sol LeWitt had a work inside. And I was in a competition, I think it was Martin Purrier, Walter Di Maria, and John Borofsky. And, it was submitted to the outside judges and they picked me. And, my position was that, you're mediating a situation. You're not making anything that's an equivalent. I mean, art's not an equivalent necessarily of anybody else's experience. And I think it's effective.
Well, art is also a way that we as human beings try to, if not make sense of, to deal with history in the past. It's one of the ways that we...
Well, I mean, all memorials deal with the past.
The title of
In
this
fact,
is...
I mean, the big transformation in sculpture was no longer about memorialization, but it was really about the artist's experience in the world. But historically, almost all public work was, collective memory. So to some extent, I mean, the form that I made really was about a collapsing figure and the collapse of culture. But, that's not the equivalent of, of catastrophe. But anyway, it was challenging and it looks good. I went back and it's become part of the Washington firmament. I mean, it's like, I was visiting, because I took my grandchildren to Washington and, a guy runs up in a jogging outfit, to the sculpture. It was part of his course. He had to run to 8 or 9 different monuments in the city. So it really is an important part. I wouldn't take him inside, they're too young. Anyway, it was important. It was important work for me. Yeah, this is a work I showed in the Haus der Kunst in a small room. Mm-hmm. So it was an iron house and a kind of vaporizing, light, floating wood house. This has a lot to do with the show.
Yeah. Not only the suspended form, but also, if we can, I'm going to go back to the next one, which is one of the earliest ones, but that house.
Where are we? This here?
Yeah, the 1974 piece, mounted to the wall on this kind of, I don't know what to call that coming out of the wall.
Well, that was an interesting piece.
But the house.
Now, I remember talking to somebody about this. I gave a talk at Cal Arts, and I had seen Donatello's David, in Florence, and I was so intrigued by the angle of the helmet and how Donatello established the space of the perceiver and controlled the space of the perceiver, which, by the way, I think he did, and I think that's why he's the greatest. And I remember this kid laughing, how can you compare yourself to Donatello? I said, well, I'm not comparing myself to Donatello. I'm trying to utilize something he figured out, which most artists haven't, most people don't understand. Anyway, that wasn't what that piece was about. This piece was about memory, the future, and the present. Whatever artists think about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's complicated. You think about your own history and, how are you going to get out of the miserable psychological state you're in, and where are you going to go, and can anyone read that or see that? And the next piece.
Here, we'll show that.
That little chair. Now, I had a show of this work at Paula Cooper again. I mean, I originally showed it with Paula in 74. And I made the piece in 73, 74. At that point, the other thing about my work is I think I've always insisted on the size, and I haven't pumped the work up, to fit a certain context. So, and nobody's invented a chair, no artist. I mean, every artist has used chairs, or many, many people have. Piero della Francesco's little chair. So it was sort of so the size of the chair was very much about me and my sense of, melodramatic isolation, whatever it may be, and trying to engender that little space, where you sit. And so, I just decided, I would just show it the size I made it in a kind of public space. And it really condensed space. It had a radical shift in scale. So I was worried, when I did this show, I thought, oh, this stuff's never going to work again. It's like, it was so contextual and so much about perceiving it at the time I made it. But actually, it did the same stuff again. If it's properly installed, it boom, it condenses space. Now, I'm not the only artist who's condensed space. Look at the two little Giacomettis at the Nasher. But actually, I think the way Giacometti did, the insistence on his modeling in hand and a smaller figure.
But there's an important thing about the relationship of the viewer to that minuscule thing on the floor. And so, there were rectangular cast iron forms, the chair, forms that looked like houses that were all, that were placed on the floor with a lot of space around them. And then this piece, which is in the Nasher collection, that's on view again.
Well, you could see this piece. Is this the one up now?
Yeah, that's the one
You
up
could
there,
see
right.
this piece as sort of, so in this thing, I'm engendering that interior space. So the outside's a boundary. When I did this work, I was well aware that it was, maybe it took me 3 or 4 years to get away from the notion of, what I didn't like was flatness, that the work was on the floor and then the top of the work was parallel to the floor, which seemed to me that's why I began making those reaching pieces that you call the Breakdancer. I really wanted the work to be animate within the space and not dependent on flatness like painting. So, or Don Judd for that matter, where a lot of minimalism accepts the floor as the arena and the standard to work. I don't. I felt it was one way of differentiating myself. But you can see this interior in a way as the next room over.
Yeah.
So now I have the great interior space, but I'm projecting thought into it. It's no longer about it. It's a different kind of declaration. It's more proactive, more mature artist.
But the sense that that space, whether it is small and presented on the floor, or whether it's a large object in an even bigger space, there's always that sense of how one encounters it, and even the house that has the projection coming out from underneath it from the wall, there's that sense of how the viewer experiences that object in a physical space.
Well, I think better sculptors. I was thinking about this because anyone see the Donatello show last spring at the Museum of the Bible, which unfortunately closed, but I don't know how these people did it, but they had 10 Donatello, not 10, maybe 6 Donatellos and Brunelleschi models. I'll never throw out an interior model again. Anyway, it was just, and you could compare Donatello to his peers. The peers were lovely sculpture, and they may have been a nice likeness of Saint Jerome or something, but they didn't consider the perceiver, where Donatello really, in a way, there was a theatricality. He was very aware of how people would look at the work, and the work is animate and active in a way that other sculpture of that period is not. It's really, everyone knows he's a profound, great genius, but That's the reason why. I don't know if it's been articulated that way. Then somebody in New York found a little pootie that he thinks is a Donatello, and he had a show. I didn't see it. And all these heavy German art historians wrote texts trying to justify that this was indeed a Donatello. I think it may be. It closed with a picture of my book, well, a picture of my work. So I bought 2 copies. I thought, gee, only if my mother could have seen that. But it's sort of a joke. I mean, they're trying to justify, they're trying to utilize contemporary art to justify the authenticity of the Donatello, what may or may not be a Donatello. And I think the piece is still around. I have to go see it. And God only knows what it was selling for. Probably cheaper than contemporary art.
But this interest in space and our experience of objects in space, I mean, all sculptors deal with this, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what sculptors, well, no, but if you're involved with likeness, you're trying to do works that's mimetic.
Right.
It may be mimetic, but it might just be statuary. It may not be about an experience. And I also think, it's the artist's responsibility to a certain extent, determine how work is perceived.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think someone like Donatello was an absolute genius. Well, many people were. I mean, anyway, he in particular. Oh, this is an installation I did.
I had to include this because
no one knows it.
It's from 1969.
It's made out of baling wire, and it was a room in a small college in Georgia. A friend of mine was teaching. It was an African American college. I forget which one. He was teaching art, so he invited me to come down and do something. So I went to the local feed store. I went to one yesterday, and I bought. I don't know how baling wire was. Baling wire is baled up with baling wire, but it's sort of interesting. It's interesting in retrospect.
That dynamic occupation of the space, and then, the drawings also deal with space in a really interesting way. I mean, the way that the small figures on the or the houses on the floor are like a figure on a ground.
Well, the early drawings, those banded drawings, had a lot to do with. Because I did a lot of work where there were little apertures. I think DMA has one. Where you sort of enter into you sort of look at a space and you have to magically enter into it. The reason I stopped doing that small work, aside from the floor, I was not interested in magical thinking. And I thought that work, it was just too psychological and too much of a small, other world. It just is not something that I love. I've always wanted my work in the real world, or I didn't want to be in the magical world of, an artist who's totally deceiving themselves and structuring a kind of synthetic life around the work.
So there are 26 works on paper in the exhibition at the Sculpture Center here. There are 26 works on paper.
Oh, in the exhibition.
And
yeah.
most people are used, you've been making drawings, paintings, works on paper since the very beginning with the fingerprint works.
Yeah, I have the history of my drawing. I mean, the first drawings exhibited were fingerprint drawings. I did a show at Craig Starr of those.
Yeah. Not too long ago. Just
not too
last
long.
year.
Really early work from the late 60s. I've always drawn. I just say that artists, I think, at least I can say for myself, that to some extent, sculpture, regardless if it's immediate or not immediate, is very involved. There are logistics involved that are time consuming. So it takes a long time to build something. And frequently, like the early drawings, these sort of more geometric drawings, I don't know what's up there.
Yeah, they're up there right now.
A lot of it had to do with, particularly the maybe wilder, with doing things on paper that essentially would have been burdensome to do or in the real world, or doing things on paper that you couldn't do. So I mean, to a certain extent, the drawings might anticipate things I would eventually do in sculpture, or they might refer back to things I've done. They're never mimetic. They don't look like the sculpture, but they're fast. They're relatively, in a drawing, again, now you have the page. So the page, to some extent, you have to overwhelm the page. And more recently,
So these are two of the drawings that are included in the exhibitions, which are, and all of the drawings are from 2015. So just these are all from last year, and
well,
you can sense a distinct change in the.
Well, I got tired of working with chalk and rigidity, so I started doing gouaches again maybe 3 years ago. And I had an exhibition at Pace. It was a very good show. I thought it was it was an interesting exhibition. You have the catalog, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, again, I thought those things weren't deep enough. So I began doing these drawings, which are I thought, very deep and meaningful.
And a lot of them are related, are loosely related to each other, because you would apply ink to a page and then lay another page over it, transfer.
Well, they were, yeah. I mean,
and then continue working on the transferred page.
And then I changed them. Well, I just wanted deep, meaningful drawings.
They're really loose and atmospheric, and I mean, there's a very complex sense of depth within.
Well,
them
they're
because
two
of that.
batches of. I mean, some are freer and more buoyant, and others are really sort of bereaved and deep. No, it's a really good batch of drawings. What a way to talk about my work. I'm acting as if I'm talking about food or something. Anyway. But you should see the show. I mean, spend some time in it. And thanks. I think I'm wrapped up. Any questions? Oh, sorry, Jed.
No.
I'm very curious about your workspace that you've had over time and how that might have changed and therefore been reflected in the work that you choose to do.
Oh, I think so, but not. I mean, I've had my first studio was about 2,000 square foot. It was a loft building downtown. No longer an old federal building, a pretty building. And now I have a really large studio, which allows me to see things that I normally would not see. But I'm really adamant. I'm opposed to the colossal. Like, I don't like colossal. I don't trust it. It has a meaning that I'm opposed. Also, art has a political side to it. And I don't mean. I'm not talking political party. I mean, but certain work has to do with a certain aspect. One sense of humanity and freedom and this and that. So I don't like big, imposing structures. So, yeah.
Pointy question. I have a question about your use of colour. And obviously, I'm a sculptor who uses colour a lot. And there seems to be a real specificity to the use of colour and what hue of yellow and how it's applied on especially these pieces here. Some are sort of very fine thin washes and some are a little bit more dense. So maybe, and obviously in the drawings, the history of the drawings have had these blocks of colour, but it seems like there's maybe an inner story to some of the colours. And I haven't heard you talk about the color.
Oh, well, yeah, I didn't talk about the color. I mean, colors always played a role. Well, that's because somehow we were looking more at, woody, bronze stuff. I've always used color. I mean, color was a way of, the big idea about paint and color, I mean, basically is color. If you have wood, think of wood as nature, something natural, and think of color as something. This really sounds as sort of as a thought, as a kind of as culture. It's sort of, you know, it's a choice you make. Today I want to wear a pink shirt. That's a cultural choice. I want to wear a pink shirt because it looks good with green. It's the only shirt I have left. But so I say if I choose to paint a piece yellow, the paint itself is a kind of, so you're masking or hiding to some extent what the material of the sculpture is made out of. These sculptures are made out of 1/16 Baltic birch. I mean, it's sort of, well, 1/8 inch Baltic birch. It's pretty ordinary European plywood. Comes in 5 by 5 foot section. So I choose, so you're painting it, it means you're hiding the material or you're allowing some of the material, you're putting an envelope between the material and the perceiver and between yourself and the material. You're kind of engaged, you're marking it with paint. Okay, this is mine, I'm going to paint it. Assistant may have helped me on it, but now I'm going to destroy all their work. I'm going to slather paint on it. Anyway, then the way you approach the paint and the color, you know, that's so subjective. I mean, so, you know, the big orange piece, it was a very intense orange. It was like cad orange medium and powdered pigment that I mixed with casein. So it's really intense. And it was overwhelming. That green piece could never engulf that orange piece if the orange piece was so intense. I mean, it really stood out. So I repainted it. You know, I toned down the paint with white and repainted it. So now the surface of that piece is a more considered surface than the color, than the surfaces of the other pieces. Like the red one, which I wanted to be kind of bloody and liquid, you know, is very, the guy's got fingerprints on it, which didn't bother me because the piece was so sort of amorphous, the paint, and so kind of transparent. You see through the paint and you have a better sense of the wood. So, you know, how you paint and the choice of color can be very psychological. Color definitely has reference. I mean, I painted the green thing because I wanted to look sky-like and landscapey. But, you know, I mean, then there's a sub thing. You know, we have, you know, this is pretty, I mean, the only thing missing, I think, in there, how many colors in the chart? You know, we have 3 primaries and orange and green. And once you get into the process of working on a piece, you know, things flow. And you're making all these choices. They're not, when I talk about them, I'm intellectualizing them. I think when you're doing them, they're much more instinctive and they're much more about your own history of work. And I've always used color as a mask, as a way of, as a surrogate for casting, as a way of unifying. You know, if you have something made out of 15 pieces and you paint it all one color, you kind of unify the experience, depending on it. And certain colors you perceive from a distance, and, you know.
Well, you had also selected.
Nancy?
The thing that was so surprising the other night was when you're outside looking in and you see the reflection of these pieces. You see the shadow, you see their shape, different shapes on the floor, and the ceiling. You also see the colors on the floor and the ceiling. I mean, it is not, did you know, or you probably did, the impact of these forms and all of those dimensions, you know, in this space when you were making it? In other words, it is so dynamic and powerful, you know, with all these various reflections and changes.
Yeah,
Was that a surprise
Well, no, I mean, it was a surprise. I mean, but you know, I think that's how the most phenomenal thing is that the green one in certain light conditions becomes a positive. But I mean, I think if you really work with a certain degree of freedom, you know, it sounds Pollyannish, with good thing. I mean, that's a great space. I mean, the Nasher Gallery is a phenomenal. It's one of Renzo's great buildings. It's just the perfect place to have an exhibition. I mean, I've seen bronzes in there that look good, and it's all very natural. So it's all stone. There's no color. There's color, but the color is natural color. So when you have this sort of natural, considered environment, and you put in your own form, that's much more subjective, and color that's much more subjective, it really comes alive. Now, because the first time I saw that violet reflection on the floor, there's something to be said about great daylight. I did an outdoor sculpture with color, and I had no idea that the external colors were reflecting and creating a third color. And I think that happens in the gallery too. No, looking at it the other night, it was phenomenal. It was unbelievable. I mean, I've never seen work look like that. Mine or anyone else's. I'm not talking about I'm not saying this is something I achieved, but it was just phenomenal. I hope somebody got good pictures. I tried to get a good picture of it. It wasn't so easy. And then seeing, Mark's piece and that fabulous, which is a great sculpture, and that fabulous Anthony Caro, where Caro's just flinging stuff into space. I mean, it's great. And then going inside and seeing David Smith and Tony Smith. I mean, you could see all that from the garden. You could see a lot of the sculpture in the adjacent room, and you could see the piece from North Park. It was great. It's an experience. I should have made a movie, but I had too much to drink.
Why don't we take one more question?
Any more questions? Yes.
You talk a lot about action and movement in your work, but have you ever considered...
I can't hear you. Calm down.
You talk a lot about action in your work and how it's really...
Oh, action activity.
Yeah. So have you ever considered like mobiles or motors or anything to get your work physically moving?
Have I ever made mobiles?
Have you ever considered mobile?
I did early on, I did a piece in it was the first Whitney program that my wife, she was a teacher and she was invited to do this. And I did an early piece where I had two like washers. It was really crazy. On the ceiling chasing each other. I mean, they were animate, but I've never done mobiles. I mean, I'd rather have somebody walk around and that becomes the change than the work move around. And it's hard to do. I mean, Calder has the mobile very locked up. It's hard to do anything. I've had pieces where parts dangle. But I've never done anything that was sort of in motion, or where I wanted it to be in motion, other than some early probes.
Well, great.
I'd rather make you do the work. You have to walk around and look. Any other questions?
All right, well, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you coming out. And Joel, thank you.